Doom came to Red Hill. A ghost story by Evrim Ersoy and Pentagram Home Video.
Come in. Hello, Father.
Hello, young man. I believe we are to be neighbors for this journey on such a dreadful evening. I'm grateful all the same. As I was told, I'm lucky to have found a seat on this train at such short notice.
Don't tell me your plane was diverted to Boston, too.
Ah, a fellow unfortunate. Young man, it seems we have much in common. Were you, by any chance, headed to Washington, D.C.?
Indeed, Father. Pleasure to make the acquaintance of another weary traveler. Name's Kennedy.
Michaels. Father Michaels. And what do you do, Mr. Kennedy?
I'm kind of a writer, journalist by trade. But I have a particular interest in folklore and spend my time wishing I could focus on that.
Maybe a book one day.
You never know, Father. Worse crimes have been committed in the name of literature. And what takes you to Washington, D.C.?
A friend needs my help. An old, dear friend. It seems he's encountered a difficult problem. And a long time ago, I promised him I would aid him if he ever needed me again.
I'm guessing that this is something that happens to you often, Father. Call to those in need.
Yes, but not in the spooky ways you're imagining. More often than not, I provide comfort, some advice, and perhaps a shoulder to cry on.
Well, fate is one hell of a tool in the right hands, and I stress the word hell there.
Am I to infer by those somewhat cynical words you're not much of a believer, my son?
Well, it's less a question of belief and more a difficulty in understanding the world outside of this one, Father.
It's our faith in God that sometimes grants us those perceptions.
And yet, that faith sometimes blinds us. Imperceptibly so. You know, that reminds me of something, the power of faith and what it can do. How it can spread fear through a town.
I'd very much like to hear about it, Kennedy. This will be a long journey, and anything to break up the monotony will be much appreciated.
There's a hill near where I'm from that seems to have been surrounded by local superstition for as long as people sat around a fire to tell ghost stories. A recurring story, going back to the time of my grandfather and probably his father before him, was of the shrouded ghost. A figure that would appear on the hillside at sunset, its face covered by a dark cloth. You'd hear this story every couple of years, but one autumn someone had seen something that terrified them so much that nothing that could be said could convince them to leave the local church that night. The story spread over the coming weeks and there were more sightings. It whipped the parish up into a frenzy, and for one thing, Father, it did a lot to pack the church on a Sunday in a time where attendance would have lapsed. My family grew up outside of the church, and that was a strange thing at the time. But it gave me the perspective to watch what happened unfold outside of the hysteria that seemed to grip the town. In the 1970s, the story of the shrouded ghost had caused such panic amongst parishioners that they had petitioned to have a priest bless the hill. That's one of the only records you'll find of that story in the papers of the time. That line. I spent a fair amount of time digging into that one, but people are quiet in small towns and stories like this are quick to fade back into folklore. The locals called for the hill to be blessed. The priest was Father Thomas. By all accounts, a rational man. There's so much in our culture that's tied to our older religions, as I'm sure you know well, Father, and you don't have to venture too far into the countryside to find that those beliefs are still very real for people. Anyway, this priest, I think he made the decision that what he needed to ease the distress in the town was to perform a ritual blessing, a blessing from the church. From what I was told about him as a man, he had a modern take on faith, and it was unlikely, and this is in my opinion now, he believed that there was anything on that hill beyond these echoes. Do you know what I mean? Those echoes of superstition. The beliefs of the people carried on, of the people of the town. Things he himself wouldn't have had any sway with at all. It's the things that the subconscious doesn't let go of. No matter how hard we try, even as time passes and the old superstitions fade, the things that return in the dark for us. A blessing from the church father, but a blessing with no real faith behind it, and it's this, the lack of faith in the ritual, and maybe his own lack of faith in the validity of his own religion, because as I thought about it afterwards, if it was a sacred ritual, why would he perform it or agree to perform it when he knew there was nothing there? Another danger, Father, although you know I believe in our friend, or at least believe in his own convictions of belief, because doubt is what led to what happened to Father Thomas on the hill. He set out from the church on a December afternoon, the 21st in fact, and the reason I remember that so clearly is I got stuck in a train station in Bangor that same night. It wasn't until 3 days later that I got the call. The priest was gone, and the hill was ablaze. It was a local man, McControversy, worked in the harbour. He was the last to talk to him that afternoon, not the last to see him alive, I should add at this point, lest you think I'm about to tell you that Father Thomas disappeared into the trees in the hill and was never seen again. Now, that would be a proper ghost story, wouldn't it? Especially for a night like tonight, and the train that we're on now. But this is a good little tale all the same, and might give you a bit of perspective into what I think of the power of the mind and the danger of superstition, the effect that it can have on a situation that's volatile. Like the one this train is taking us closer and closer to. Father Thomas took the path up through the hill, and it's at this point the light would have been fading. And I know from my own experience how quickly the mind can play tricks as the colour drains from the landscape around you. He said he left the path and walked into the trees. Not too far in. And it was here, he said afterwards, that he saw a man out walking. And Thomas was a friendly sort and knew all his parishioners well, but he couldn't see who it was from a distance, so he picked up pace in the direction of the man. But it appeared he lost him here. His fellow walker on the hill, who seemed to disappear into the trees. And as it was getting dark now, he turned around to head back, and found his path blocked by a man whose face was covered by a shroud. He told Mrs. Loughlin, parish caretaker, that the wind had blown against the face and had revealed for a moment, in relief, the features hidden by the shroud. It was hideous, he had told her, and compared to horror to that which he had felt about large spiders in his youth. As if the figure that stood before him was a manifest of all that was fear in the world. He'd run from the clearing in which he stood and swore that as he passed a skeletal hand had risen to touch his face. And in this moment, it had known all his sins and held them up in front of him. Now here's the strange part. Father Thomas says he was on the hill for days, that he'd experienced the setting sun twice, and each day had been spent trying to find his way off the hill as the sun got lower in the sky and the hill was once again filled with darkness. In reality, it was 9 p.m. on the night of the 21st, just a few hours after he'd left his own church, that he'd stepped back onto the street at the foot of the hill. He'd entered the bar, which had been full of people on a night in the run-up to Christmas. He told his parishioners that he'd seen the devil on Red Hill. There was no salvation to be found there. Well, the hill caught fire on Christmas Eve and turned the sky red. It could be seen for miles along the coast in the winter night. It spread from the gorse near the obelisk and tore down through the trees in the first hour, and there was nothing that could be done. The irony, though, and I hope you'll forgive me that I take a bit of pleasure in this, is that it burned Father Thomas's church to the ground, and thankfully nothing else. It was the opinion that he'd started the fire himself, and in doing so, had destroyed his own house of God. This could never be proved, though, and Thomas himself, well, he left the church, drank himself to death. Only a young man, but could never get past the fact that he believed he saw the devil on the hill that night. Would tell the story to anyone who'd buy him a drink. The danger of belief in superstition, Father, was strong enough that it destroyed a man and saw a hill burned to the ground. By the time I was back in the country again, the hill was back to how it was. Now, this is something that I don't understand, but I'm sure there's a rational explanation to it. There's a clearing on the hill where the land remained black, the soil all around it. It only returns to red in the autumn, when the leaves begin to fall. But in the center of the clearing, there's a pine tree that's black. It looks dead, even feels like scorched wood to the touch. But every year, it still bears pine cones. Pine cones that are completely black. Now, our mutual friend hates the fact that I get a kick out of the church being burned to the ground, but I enjoy the idea that maybe in some way it's part of our pagan, pre-Christian past reclaiming the hill, reclaiming it back to its rightful owners. Now I know I'm skeptical, Father, but that doesn't mean that I don't think there aren't some mysteries left to the world. Just not shrouded ghosts on the hill. Or possessions. There was one time, though, there on the hill, one autumn, coming down the steps from the obelisk in the late afternoon, a man stepped out from the trees and quickly crossed the path, disappearing into the woods. It was so brief that I can't be sure about what I think I saw, but that night my dreams, replaying the event every time I drifted off. There was a shroud that concealed his face, and an accompanying dread that I didn't want to see what was hidden underneath. Now, I hadn't thought about that for a long time until tonight, telling you this story. And I don't know how much of that memory is real. Well, what I do know is that I stayed off the hill until the summer returned the following year. It's funny how thoughts can return like that. Father, it was never my intention to cause any offense.
You misunderstand my silence. I'm taken aback by your story. You purport to be a man of no faith, of much doubt. And yet your story betrays your inner conflict. There are moments of truth within each word we say, and there are shadows behind each honest moment in which we hide.
Isn't it funny how each thing that happens upon this earth can be seen through many angles? Like looking at a shattered mirror and seeing images all distorted. Forevermore.
It's often told us that there's always some reason why God only lets us see the whole picture when He deems it so.
And yet you spend your life finding your faith tested, without anything to show for it. Don't you find His way conflicted, Father? Don't you ever think the journey is far crueler than it ever need be?
You know, I asked that question to myself a long time ago. when my heart was filled with a lot more than just doubt. It was almost 10 years ago, and I'd been sent upstate to administer rites at a prison. It was an old place, built almost a century ago, and had hosted the worst kind of criminal element. Prisoners who were sentenced to death were transferred to this place until their final day. It was a dark place, having been baptized in death, now forever carried its seal. I was a young man at the time, out of seminary by maybe 5-6 years. There was an element of bravado in my approach, a touch of youthful folly. I tell you this just to give you an idea about myself, and to allow you a sense of my mental state at that moment. My duty of care was to be for a 3-month period, whilst my predecessor took a break. Looking after men condemned for their lives takes its toll on you, whether you want it to or not. Day after day, you walk down cold stone corridors, looking in the eyes of men who you're never sure are really repentant. Some defy their imprisonment, their anger overriding any sense of regret, and others simply cannot believe where they've ended up, their mental state no better than that of a child. Most often, though, prisoners just hated seeing a priest, especially one so young. I remember the day I first set step on the ward. A wall of noise greeted me. Obscenities mixed with spitting, insults, threats. I remember my heart beating fast in my chest, fear mingled with a sense of isolation, the temptation to turn tail, to run. Stronger than I expected, but my sense of duty, not only to God, but to myself as a human being, compelled me to stay. And to this day, I'm not sure I did the right thing. There is no such thing as routine in a prison for a priest. You can be called out at all hours, as the prisoners may find themselves flung into the darkest recesses of the mind. Sometimes, days would go by where I would have no word, where I'd find myself walking through the streets of the town nearby with not much to do, a man on holiday. And then there'd be days where I'd be sat in a cell until the early hours, hearing the burden of a man's soul, its contents dark, filled with details that broke your heart. I cannot share with you much of those moments, but let me just say, they changed me as much as I tried to change those men. After about 2 weeks though, I felt my soul settling down in some weird way. Human nature being what it is, even under the direst circumstances, we let a sense of routine comfort us. And hence, I found myself following the same routes, the same routines, as much as the plea of those incarcerated men allowed me. But, as usual, God had other plans than what I was expecting. It was a clear November morning when I first met Jack Skell. He'd been sent over from another prison way up north, to wait for the fateful day when he'd meet the hangman's noose. He didn't strike me as a particularly remarkable man, and I don't mean that in a derogatory manner. Often prisoners would consist of a multitude of personalities, of traits, and each one would come across in a different way. Skell seemed to be closed off to the world, not just to me, but to the whole prison, the guards, the other inmates. It's as if he had shut down the shutters to the outside and only the faintest light would bleed in through. Never enough to bother him. He also made no request of my services, so for a while, just remained a face I saw out of the corner of my eye as I walked to and fro from other cells. Something about him, though, remained in the back of my mind. Something I could not quite describe yet. It was at the end of a particularly long night the first time he spoke to me. I'd stayed up talking to one of the inmates, a man whose time was now perilously close, and whose soul fear had gripped fervently. He had confessed his sins to me over and over again over the course of the night, and as dawn approached, somehow had managed to fall asleep, his soul unburdened. Whereas I was filled with a sense of regret, anger, and disgust at what I had to hear, and could hardly wait to get away. I know you may think me a hypocrite giving these men comfort and yet sitting in judgment, but that never was my aim. It was my own nature that failed me from time to time, and this was one of the trials of my vocation that I took very seriously. And yet, keen as I was to leave, I found myself stopped in my tracks by a soft voice from down the corridor. "Father," it whispered. "Father." Its urgency gave me pause. "Father," it begged. "Father, please." I looked down the dark hallway, and there was no indication of life. I gathered my things, left the cell, indicated for the guard to come and lock it. As I started to walk down the long and dark corridor, a face peered at me, eyes sunken with lack of sleep. "Father," the man pleaded. "Father, do you have time to speak to me?" "My son, it's late, but I'd be happy to visit you tomorrow," I said firmly. He looked at me for a second, his expression impossible to read. And then, as he withdrew into the shadows of the cell, I heard, "Tomorrow, then." I did not get much sleep. My dreams were full of ugly crimes, of sinful thoughts, and the shortcomings of men. When I woke up a fitful few hours later, I was covered in sweat and a sense of disgust. Even a hot shower wasn't enough to let me feel cleansed. Upon my return to the prison, I found myself summoned by the warden, a jovial middle-aged man who neither mistreated the prisoners nor lost sight of the fact that this was just a job to him. He was always pleasant with me, keenly aware that my position often meant I had to hear some of the most horrifying confessions, most frightening details that he was spared. Entering his office, I found him reading a case file. Without raising his head, he indicated for me to sit down. "Father," he began, "I understand that Skal has made a request for you to see him." He paused. "Normally, I'd have no problem granting this. Every inmate has the right to see a doctor or a priest whenever they need to. But Skal is a special case, so I want you to understand the situation before you find yourself in his cell." I nodded for him to continue. There was an element of youthful arrogance that almost dared him to challenge me. "Skal is in death row, that much you know. However, he's also one of those rare inmates who has not confessed all of his crimes. There are still bodies unaccounted for, and whenever pressed, he tends to get violent. I guess what I'm trying to say, Father, is be vigilant. If it feels at any point like Skal might get emotional, may strike out, please summon a guard. He has hurt people before, and I have no doubt he will again. I'm going to make sure a guard is within the reach of the cell at any given point. I just want to stress how important your safety is to us." With that, he rose, shook my hand, and let me out of the door. And so it was, on a cold and frigid November afternoon, that I found myself led to the cell of the man who would affect my lives in ways I never expected. The first time I saw Skal in the light, I was shocked. Maybe it was because he was everything I did not expect him to be. Small, sickly, fragile-looking, it was hard to believe this was the man who had committed so many crimes. He was sitting on his bed, staring at the wall when the guard opened the cell and let me in. I stood there, waiting for an acknowledgement that never came. Finally, I crossed the threshold and stood in front of him. "Father Michaels," I said in what I thought to be an authoritarian voice, "pleasure to officially meet you." Skal took a cursory look at me and finally gestured for me to sit. I obliged. And for the next hour, we just sat in silence. At the end of the hour, I stood up to leave. It felt to me like the whole visit had been a waste, and I could not understand why the man who was so urgently trying to talk to me the night before was so unresponsive now. But before I could leave, Skal grabbed my hand, his grip weakened gingerly. "Father," he said in a voice between pleading and begging. "Father, they won't let me be." I looked down at him and indicated for him to continue. His eyes wandered back to that particular spot on the wall and then back to me. "Father, I'm not a good man. I did things I regret. Not everything they accuse me of is true, but I killed, and I'm not proud of it. At first I thought it would not affect me, the guilt. I thought I was made of stronger stuff. But no one ever talks about the night, Father. In the dark, the voices, they talk, and..." "What voices, Jack?" "The dead, Father. Those you wronged. They're never angry. They're never violent. No, it's worse than that. It's disappointment. It's your failure that they keep bringing back." "Your conscience pricks at you, Jack. It's clear that your actions have not only hurt your victims, but you too." "You don't understand, Father. This is not my conscience. They're actually here, talking to me." "And what do they want, Jack?" "They want me to die." With this statement, he seemed genuinely scared, like somehow his death could be caused by entities from another world. "Do you think confessing might help, Jack?" "I'm past that, Father, way past that. My hour comes closer every day, and I just wanted another soul to know what I was going through. The guards here don't listen, and the other inmates would think I'm mad. I thought maybe a man of the cloth like you would understand something supernatural." "Jack, I believe in God, but I'm not sure." Before I could finish, I saw his eyes widen, ever so imperceptibly, still staring at that damn spot on the wall. I turned, and believe me, I don't ever understand these words myself. There was a split second where instead of the shadows on the wall, I saw a figure standing there. I blinked, and it was gone. That was the first and the last time Jack Skell talked to me. He never asked to see me again, never asked for confession, and yet some fascination kept me on his case. I walked past his cell often, but peering inside, he seemed to be shrouded in darkness. Even on the brightest day, his figure held back by personal shadows. Time passed, days into weeks, into months, and it was one fine summer day that I realized Skell's cell was empty. The guard, when I inquired, told me Skell's execution was near, and he was transferred to the waiting cell for his last 24 hours. I immediately went to the warden to request to be present at his execution. He regarded me warily, for Skell had not requested a priest, but maybe from a sense of obligation gave me his approval. And that is how, after 24 hours, I found myself standing in the viewer's gallery as Skell was led forward onto the gallows. I was almost alone in there, no family, no victims' relatives, only a few officials, and as Skell was led up the steps, we all watched dispassionately. The sentence was read one last time, the noose put around his neck, and finally, with the clock striking 12, the warden gave the nod to throw the switch. The trapdoor below him gave way, but instead of the usual instant drop and broken neck, Skell started choking. And for what felt like the longest 5 minutes of my life, I watched him strangled to death. And yet, there's one part of that execution that changed me. And it was not the mechanical failure, as they later classified it, that chilled me to my bones. No, it was the split second when the lights within the prison flickered. And in that instant, I saw what had caused the failure. A gaggle of figures gathered around Skell, little girls who held up his feet to prolong his suffering, or to make him understand their pain, or just for their self-satisfaction. I just don't know. All I know is what the system called a mechanical failure felt to me like divine retribution. One of those figures looked at me. I know because I'll never forget that skeletal smile as long as I shall live. Then, Skell gave his last breath. Their revenge had been done.
That's quite a story, Father. Whether I believe it or not, it has certainly contributed to an interesting night. Look, the sun's on the horizon. Can't be far now.
I never asked what you were doing in Washington, D.C., Kennedy.
Just like you, Father, I was summoned here by a friend.
This friend, did he ask you because he needs your help?
I think so. He's always been.
Last stop, Washington, D.C., gentlemen. We are approaching Washington, D.C. Are you Mr. Kennedy, sir?
Yes, Sam.
A telegram for you. Urgent, or so I've been told.
Thank you. God.
Good grief, man, you're white as a sheet. Are you alright? What does the blasted thing say?
Karis. Karis is dead.